In just a few years, power meters have moved from being pro team only black magic to being affordable training aids for amateur racers and even sportive riders. But which one to buy? To find out, we gathered 9 of the most important power meters on the market and put them through the most rigorous testing process we've ever carried out. It took over 7 months, more than 70 rides, over 1,000 miles. The whole time we were always riding with 3 power meters at once. And we achieved this by always using a Powertap hub in the rear wheel, a crankset, and one of the pedal power meters. This combination gives us real insight. By repeating the rides over and over with these 3 power meters running at the same time, you really get to see the pattern of how each one behaves. Now, of course, the more meters you have running concurrently, the clearer the picture you get. 3 is the realistic maximum that you can achieve. If you were to run just 2 power meters together, then you might see some disagreement between them, but you get a kind of he said, she said scenario, and you're not sure which one is accurate and which one's reading either high or low. With 1 power meter on its own, you've really got no idea what it's doing. You can't feel 10 or really even 20% difference in your legs. So you just don't know if it's accurate or not. In testing the power meters, there are 5 main things to which we're paying attention. Accuracy is of course a big concern, and we established this with the repeated rides and by constantly triangulating our testing between 3 power meters at once. Next is consistency. When you're using just 1 power meter, as of course nearly everybody would be, then it's the consistency of your data in relation to all of your other training data that is arguably even more important than the accuracy of that data. If it's reading 2% above or below what a different meter might say for your efforts, it doesn't really matter so long as you have consistent relationship to all of your other training data. Third is the ability of the power meter to compensate for temperature variation during a ride. Now, power meters work with strain gauges. Because it's such a thin piece of metal, the strain gauge itself is vulnerable to temperature changes. And so in some power meters, you can see variations in readings as temperature shifts during a ride. For instance, if you leave early in the morning, it might be 6 degrees and quickly warm up to sort of 10, 11, 12. That can trip up some power meters. So it's extremely important that your power meter is able to compensate for that temperature variation itself. Otherwise, you'll be stopping every half hour to do another manual zero offset through your Garmin, and you'll never be confident of your data. Fourth is usability. This is fairly straightforward. We're looking at how easy the power meter is to install, whether you need to glue magnets to the frame, whether there's a really complicated calibration process you have to go through every ride, or whether you can simply jump on and go. Finally, transferability. Power meters are really expensive. You can't realistically hope to put one on all 3 of your bikes if you're lucky enough to have, say, a race bike, a time trial bike, and a winter bike. So transferability is really important if you hope to train with power all of the time. And we promise you, once you start training with power, you will want it on your bike absolutely all of the time. Our set of 9 power meters consisted of 4 cranksets, SRM, Quark Elsa RS, Powertap Max, and the Verve InfoCrank. In addition, we had 2 left-sided cranks, the Mark II version of the Stages, and the brand new Rotor InPower. Perhaps the most exciting of the new meters on test are the 2 pedal systems, the Garmin Vector 2 and the Powertap P1. And last but not least, we have the Powertap Gs Hub. The Powertap P1 pedal retails for £999, and before the test, it was one of the meters we were most excited about, primarily because it's the easiest to transfer out of any of them. It fits like a normal pedal. There are no pods, as you get with the Garmin Vectors, so it's extremely quick. It doesn't even need a particular torque setting. You just fit it like a normal pedal, it's on in seconds, and that's it. The Powertap P1 did give us more problems than any of the other meters on test. Some of these were down to our test set being a fairly early sample, and firmware updates did resolve some of the issues that we had. For instance, the enormous spikes in power of 56,000 watts that appeared on a few rides. Other data issues did persist, and the most troubling of these was a tendency for the P1 to overread when riding at a higher power output, for instance during interval training or a time trial. What we saw was that in relation to other power meters running alongside them, the P1 would begin to overread from around 280 to 300 watts and above. We carried out an FTP test using the P1 pedals alongside a Quark and the GS rear hub. At that point, they overread by 32 watts. Now, anyone who trains with power or has ever carried out an FTP test knows that a difference of 32 watts. It's 2 racing categories, it's enormous. It completely ruined my power profile until I deleted the data, and it really undermined my confidence in the P1s. Other issues that we had with the P1 pedals relate to the packaging rather than anything to do with the electronics. They're quite heavy, well over 400 grams for the pair, so they add more weight to your bike than any other parameter that we've tested. We're looking forward to Powertap developing the format, coming out with a version 2 in due course, but as yet it feels like it's still in a development phase. The Powertap Gs Hub is a rather different story to the P1 pedals. We were very pleased with its performance. It was very consistent, the batteries lasted well, it handles temperature variation superbly, and really is one of the standard setters in this respect. However, because the GS Hub is built into your rear wheel, it of course limits your wheel choice. So if you were to buy the more affordable version in a training wheel, you can train with it all you like, but then when you come to race, you don't have your power data available, or you're racing on a heavy training wheel. If you do want to have a race wheel available, you end up having to buy a second one, and all of a sudden it loses its price advantage. What we suggest is that you think really carefully about your future needs, whether you will want to upgrade your wheels somewhere along the line, and just really ask yourself if this is the right format for you. It's a very good parameter, but the packaging's limiting. The Garmin Vector 2 power pedals are a very significant improvement over the first version. The design of the pod is completely different. Instead of being sandwiched by the pedal up against the crank, the new version clamps over the pedal. This has proved far more robust. We've swapped these dozens and dozens of times. There's no sign of a sort of fatigue, and we've had no cracks or breakages at all. That's vastly better than the first version. In terms of performance, we still don't think it's quite there. We had quite a few issues with the Vector 2s during testing. There were multiple firmware updates as Garmin continued to develop the pedal. We're not really fans of manufacturers using their customer base for live R&D and continuing to develop a product like that. It's one thing to sort of continue development, it's another thing to finish development once a product's out in the market. And that's kind of what we feel like's happened here. The biggest issue in terms of data that we had with the Vector 2 was consistently overreading sprints by 20, even 30%. Now, if you're training a sprint session, is going to completely skew your data, and that's quite a flaw. The other problem we had was with temperature variation resilience. We found that the Vector 2s could over or underread depending on how the temperature changed in relation to other parameters. We found the solution for this was to stop and do a new manual zero offset calibration around 10 minutes into the ride once the pedals had sort of acclimatized. And that was the case even with the bike being kept in a single skin brick garage, which is more or less ambient temperature, so that's something to keep in mind. In terms of transferability, of course, being a pedal, it's far easier to swap between bikes than a crank system. However, because the Vector does use pods, and because there is a specific torque requirement for mounting the pedal to the crank, it's nowhere near as fast as the P1s. One thing that makes the Vector 2 much more appealing is its recent £300 price drop. We do still feel there are some better value options out there with more consistent and more accurate performance. However, at the rate that Garmin are developing this product, we do expect to see a Vector 3 before very long, and we think at that point they'll really crack it. The Rotor InPower is very interesting because it offers a fresh design approach by placing all of the electronics and the battery in the crank axle as opposed to attached to the crank. This design has numerous benefits. For a start, the weight is centered so that its rotational inertia is minimized. Secondly, it's protected far better from water, dirt and impacts. Thirdly, there's room for a larger battery, so it should last longer. And fourth, it enables a modular design that opens up the possibility for Rotor to build in-power cranksets using each of its crank designs. So there's a mountain bike version and also a flow crank, the aerodynamic version for time trial. The InPower scores well for usability. Very sensibly, and following criticism of the previous Power LT, it's available as a left-only crank option, whereas the Power LT was only available as a complete crankset with no option to upgrade should you already own a set of rotor cranks. The InPower uses an AAE-sized battery, which gives a claimed 300 hours of runtime. It's also easier to remove from your bike thanks to a new captive bolt design that's a lot more user-friendly than the previous type. Like Garmin, Rotor have launched their own analysis software, which features various metrics including Torque 360, which is a spin scan, an analysis of how you apply the power through the complete stroke. Of course, it should be remembered that with this being a left-sided only power meter, any analysis tools are limited in the amount of insight that they can give you without having that view of what both legs are doing. Throughout our testing, we found the rotor-in power to be consistent and accurate, and overall we were very pleased with its performance. It handled temperature variation well, although like its predecessor, the Power LT, the rotor-in power does still underread sprints, often by as much as 200 watts. If you're a racer, that's a big issue. If you're not, it probably isn't. To a great extent, the Stage's left-side only crank is the reason we're here. When it arrived in 2013, at a significantly lower price than anything else around at the time, it really democratized power meters. At launch, the Stage was unique in being a left-side only crank-based power meter. It does have several advantages. It's the lightest on test, adding just 30 grams to the DuraAce crank we have. It's a less complex device, it's very easy to fit, and of course it's more affordable. We were testing the Mark II version, which is a very important difference. It isn't really being marketed as Stage's Mark II, but if you are in the market for one, it's very important that you do get the new version. This is because water ingress had been an issue with the battery cover of the first version. That's now been improved significantly, and we had no issues at all with the new version we had on test. For us, the only downside of the Stages is inherent to its left-sided only design. When you're taking the data from one leg and doubling it, it's inherently going to be less accurate than if you're reading from both legs. This is because very few riders have a 50-50 left-right balance, and most importantly, that even if you do have a 50-50 left-right split at, say, your threshold effort, it will vary across different efforts. And also, for instance, if you have some muscle tightness in one leg, or if you have an injury, then you will absolutely get a difference in your left-right split, and that will be a variable that the Stages cannot pick up on. So while it's a very good power meter, and it's an excellent start point and introduction to training with a power meter, it does have some limitations. SRM power meters are the absolute granddaddies of this market. This year they celebrate their 30th anniversary, and they're still viewed as the gold standard and used by a number of pro teams. However, as this market has developed and new players have entered looking to push beyond what SRM have achieved, they're starting to lag behind a little bit. First and most obviously, the SRM is the most expensive on test. It started around £1,600 for an FSA Gossamer, rising to £2,800 for a DuraAce 9000 version. Secondly, you can't replace the battery yourself, you have to send it away to the importer and be without it for a few days. Thirdly, there's no pedal stroke analysis, nor is there left-right data. And lastly, the SRM does still require a magnet to be glued to your frame, whereas the others have all switched to accelerometers to detect cadence. Despite those caveats, the SRM does have a huge amount going for it. Most of all, its accuracy and consistency are exceptional. Between us around the office on a number of different SRM units, we have done thousands and thousands of miles with no issues whatsoever. It was one of only a few power meters in this test never to put a foot wrong, and it handles temperature compensation brilliantly. It's also worth noting that while you can't change the battery yourself, it does last absolutely ages, somewhere in the region of 2,000 to 3,000 hours. Given that a pretty big year of riding is maybe 300, 350 hours, changing the battery is not going to be a big problem. Now on to our top three, and in third place is the Verve Info Crank. This is a brand new meter to market last year, and it differs from the others because it was designed from the outset as a complete crankset to be a power meter. This isn't a power meter worked into an existing crankset. Verve make two bold claims for the Info Crank. First is that it's accurate to within 1% across a range from 0 to 3,000 watts, and that it's the most accurate power meter on the market. Secondly, that there is no need for any kind of pre-ride calibration. You simply get on and go. That, to anyone who's sat fiddling with their Garmin, doing a manual zero offset while their friends are pedaling off down the road from the cafe or tutting at them, will be appreciated. Throughout our testing, the Info Crank did indeed perform very well in terms of both accuracy and consistency, also impressing with its temperature compensation. We can't say if the Info Crank is accurate to 0.5% or 1%, and for all of Verve's claims, it doesn't actually do anything better than the SRM or Quark, but those two set the bar so high that there isn't much headroom above them. Two small downsides to the Info Crank. One is that the LR44 batteries, and you need two per crank, don't last very long. The claimed battery life is 500 hours. We were getting nowhere near that, more like 40 or 50 hours. Secondly, it comes with either Praxis or TA chainrings. Although they're decent, they're certainly not up to the standard of Shimano, SRAM or Campagnolo original chainrings, and we did notice a much higher frequency of dropped chains and slightly poorer shifting. First seen in 2010, the Powertap Max actually beat stages to the market with one of the industry's first affordable power meters. However, it didn't have the same transformative effect because there wasn't the same international distribution or massive marketing campaign or backing of a world tour team such as Team Sky to really popularize it. The Powertap Max Type S is an easy power meter to like. It doesn't require a magnet on the frame. The fit, thanks to a huge range of crank options, is near universal, and temperature compensation is now excellent. It's a very light design, and it's one of only 2 power meters that is available with Campagnolo crank arms, the other being SRM for £1,000 more. These strain gauges are placed in the chainring mountings rather than in the crank arms. The upgrade to Type S brings with it calculated left-right split, so it's using its understanding of your pedal position to separate your left and right power, and it does this just as effectively as the meters that are able to measure power independently thanks to strain gauges in the left and right crank arms. Throughout our testing, the consistency and accuracy of the Powertap Max was beyond reproach. It really impressed us. One small drawback of the Powertap Max Type S is that while you can change the battery yourself, it's very awkward to access and you do have to take the cranks out of the bike, which you don't have to do for other crank systems. The winner, our favourite power meter on test, is the Quarq Elsa RS. Throughout testing, it never put a foot wrong. Its performance was exemplary in all respects. Its temperature compensation, thanks to Quarq's new 10K algorithm, its accuracy, its consistency, reading sprints, high cadence, low cadence. The battery is very easy to swap yourself. It's readily accessible. It also lasts better than most. The Quarq absolutely had it nailed, and crucially, we felt like we could trust it 100% of the time. You don't get independent left-right measurement. However, you do get calculated left-right split based on crank position. And throughout our testing and compared to pedal systems running concurrently, we found that it was every bit as accurate in this respect. While we feel that the excellent Elsa RS represents good value at around £1,000, perhaps what's most impressive about the Quarq power meter range is that the same hardware, the same electronics are used all the way down to the entry-level Riken AL at just over £600. That gives you the option of a dual-sided, crank-based, exceptionally accurate power meter for the same sort of ballpark money as you'd consider paying for a left-only crank. Really, the only downside we can think of to the Quarq power meters is that there's no option for Campagnolo. Other than that, this is an outstanding power meter and it's our deserving winner. If you'd like to read more about any of these power meters, please follow the link in the video description to BikeRadar.com.